The pen made a dry, scratching sound against the thick paper, the only noise in the sterile silence of the lawyer's office. Amelia drew the final loop of her name, the ink a stark, black finality. She did not pause to read the words again. She knew them by heart. Irreconcilable differences. A quiet settlement. No contests, no claims, no further contact. It was a clean severance, a surgical removal of the last 2 years of her life. She pushed the document across the polished mahogany table toward her husband, Julian Vance, who did not even look at it. He was too busy inspecting his perfectly manicured nails, a faint, smug smile playing on his lips. She had accepted his infidelity, his cruelty, and now his dismissal, all with the same placid expression she had perfected. It was the armor she had built, piece by piece, inside the gilded cage of their marriage. He thought it was weakness, this silence. He had no idea it was the only thing that had kept her sane. She worked for a man who valued silence above all else, so she knew its weight. She was the private secretary to Dante Moretti, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in rooms like this one, a man who built empires on secrets and shadows. Julian thought her job was a quaint little hobby. He had no idea. However, the signature was not the end she had prayed for. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The moment she walked out of that office, leaving the ghost of her marriage behind, she thought she was stepping into her own life. She was wrong. She was stepping into his. Her phone buzzed less than an hour later. The caller ID was a single, severe M. She answered before the second ring. Yes. The jet is waiting at Teterboro. Wheels up in 90 minutes. Pack a bag for an indefinite stay. The voice was Luca, Mr. Moretti's head of security, a man who spoke in facts, not suggestions. Is there a problem with the quarterly reports? Amelia asked, her mind already shifting into professional gear. She was supposed to be finalizing them at the office. A pause. Luca did not do pauses. The call is not about the reports, Amelia. It's about the document you just signed. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through the numbness of her morning. I don't understand. My personal affairs have nothing to do with Mr. Moretti. He seems to believe they do, Luca said, and the line went dead. The flight was silent. The private jet was a familiar space, all cream leather and polished dark wood, but today it felt different. It felt like a cage, smaller and more confining than the one she had just escaped. She stared out the window at the sprawling lights of New York, a city that had promised anonymity and now felt like a meticulously crafted trap. Indefinite stay. The words echoed in her mind. What could her divorce possibly have to do with Dante Moretti? He was her employer, a man of immense and terrifying power, but their interactions were sterile, professional. She managed his legitimate business fronts, organized his schedule, and ensured his public-facing life was impeccable. She saw the man, not the monster. Or so she had told herself. When the jet landed, it was not at a commercial airport. A small, private airstrip was carved into a dense forest, miles from anything. A black sedan was waiting on the tarmac, its engine a low thrum in the quiet night. The air was different here. Colder. Cleaner. It smelled of pine and damp earth. Luca was waiting by the car, his expression unreadable as ever. He took her single bag without a word and opened the rear door. The drive was long, winding through roads that were not on any map she knew. They finally passed through a set of towering wrought iron gates and up a long drive flanked by ancient oak trees. The house was not a house. It was a fortress of dark stone and shadowed glass, a modern castle that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. It was Dante Moretti's home, a place she had only ever seen in architectural blueprints. He was waiting for her in his study. The room was lined with books from floor to ceiling, the air thick with the scent of old paper, sandalwood, and whiskey. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the dark landscape, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He did not turn when she entered. "Leave us," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Luca closed the door behind her, the click of the lock unnervingly loud. Amelia stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had been in his presence hundreds of times, but never like this. Never in his home. Never feeling so completely out of her depth. In the office, she was competent, essential. Here, she was an intrusion. Finally, he turned. Dante Moretti was not a large man, but he occupied a space with an absolute gravity that bent the room around him. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored so precisely it seemed a part of him. His dark hair was cut short, his face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, as if carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held you. They were the color of a winter storm, and they saw everything. He gestured to a leather armchair opposite his desk.
Seat.
It was not a request. She sat, her back straight, her posture a desperate attempt to project a calm she did not feel. He moved to his desk and sat down, placing his glass on a coaster with a quiet, deliberate click. He slid a folder across the polished surface. It was a copy of her divorce settlement. "You signed this today," he stated. Yes, her voice was steady. She would not let it tremble. "You accepted the terms. A one-time payment of $100,000. The apartment. The car. In exchange, you forfeit any and all claims to Julian Vance's assets, current and future." That's correct. She had wanted nothing from Julian. Just to be free of him. The money was an insult, a pittance from his family's fortune, and she had accepted it to make the end come faster. Dante leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. He wore a heavy gold signet ring on his right pinky finger, the only piece of jewelry she had ever seen him wear. "What you don't know, Amelia, is what else you accepted." He opened the folder to the last page, a dense addendum of financial jargon she had skimmed, trusting her lawyer's assessment that it was standard boilerplate. He tapped a finger on a single clause buried deep within the text. "Your husband was not just a degenerate gambler, Amelia. He was a thief. He embezzled $7 million from a joint shipping venture." "My shipping venture?" The air left her lungs.
Julian.
Stealing? From this man? It was a death sentence. The collateral he offered against his debt, Dante continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, was his sole ownership of a data analytics firm he was set to inherit, free and clear, upon the finalization of your divorce. "The firm is valued at 10 times the debt." He let the words hang in the air. She could feel the trap closing around her. "This clause," he tapped the page again, his finger a judge's gavel, "transfers all outstanding personal and professional liabilities held by Julian Vance at the time of signing to the recipient of the settlement. In his desperation to be free of you and your pesky morality, he signed it. And in your desperation to be free of him, so did you." He leaned back, his eyes pinning her to the chair. "Congratulations, Amelia. You are no longer Mrs. Vance. You are now $7 million in my debt." She stared at him, the crackling of the fire filling the sudden, roaring silence in her head. She had walked out of that law office thinking she had bought her freedom for a pittance. Instead, she had purchased a new, more terrifying form of bondage. The life she had planned to build, the quiet, simple existence she had craved, dissolved into smoke. Julian had not just discarded her. He had used her one last time, turning her escape into her condemnation. "That can't be legal," she whispered, the words feeling flimsy and useless in the heavy air of the room. A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but a dry, cold acknowledgement of her naivety, crossed his face. "My lawyers are very good at what they do. It is perfectly legal. And what's more, it is done." She felt a surge of defiance, a hot, angry thing that burned through the cold shock. "I don't have that kind of money. You know that. I have nothing." "You are not nothing," he corrected her, his tone flat, analytical. "You are intelligent. You are meticulous. You are discreet. And for the past year, you have managed the public face of my organization flawlessly. You have skills. Those skills have value." He rose from his chair and walked back to the window, his back to her. "Julian Vance has disappeared. He took his model to an island with no extradition treaty.
He believes he has outsmarted me."
He has left you to face the consequences. The betrayal was so complete, so utterly selfish, that for a moment, she couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the debt. It was the casual cruelty of it. He had thrown her to the wolves to save himself. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice regaining a sliver of its strength. Dante turned his head slightly, his profile etched against the dark glass. "I want what I am owed. Your time. Your loyalty. Your complete and undivided attention. You will continue your work, but not from the city. You will work from here. You will live here. You will not contact anyone from your old life. You will be, for all intents and purposes, mine until this debt is settled." It was not a job offer. It was a prison sentence. A life sentence, for all practical purposes. $7 million. She could work for 1,000 years and never pay it off. "And if I refuse?" He turned fully to face her then, and the coldness in his eyes was absolute. "There is no refusal. There is only this. Or there is the alternative. And you do not want the alternative." He did not need to elaborate. She had seen the men who came and went from his office, men with hard eyes and broken knuckles. She knew what the alternative was. She had thought this morning was the end of her life with a cruel man. She had been wrong. She had just traded a careless monster for a deliberate one. The choice was not between freedom and captivity. It was between two cages, and she was already in the stronger one. The days that followed bled into a strange, dislocated routine. She was given a suite of rooms in a quiet wing of the house, spacious and beautifully furnished, but the windows were sealed and the door locked from the outside at night. She worked from a state-of-the-art office adjacent to Dante's study, managing the same complex web of logistics, investments, and scheduling she always had. But the context was entirely different. Before, it had been a job. Now, it was servitude. She saw him every day. He would enter the office in the morning, a cup of black coffee in hand, and nod to her, a curt acknowledgement of her existence. They worked in silence for hours, the only sounds the clicking of her keyboard and the rustle of his papers. He was a creature of intense, focused stillness. He could sit for an hour without moving a muscle, his attention fixed on a document, his presence a palpable weight in the room. She learned him in a language of details. The way his jaw tightened when he was on the phone with his underboss. The faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, visible only when the light hit it just right. The way he would absently trace the engraving on his signet ring when he was deep in thought. It was a ring she had seen before, in a photograph on a side table in his study. It was a picture of a younger Dante, smiling, with his arm around an older man who looked just like him, but with a warmth in his eyes that Dante's lacked. They wore matching rings. She never saw the other man at the house. One evening, she worked late, trying to untangle a discrepancy in a set of shipping manifests. The numbers were wrong, deliberately obscured. It felt like Julian's sloppy, arrogant work all over again. Frustrated, she went to the library in search of a specific atlas. She found Dante there, standing before the fireplace, staring into the flames. The photograph from the study was in his hands. He didn't seem to notice her entry. "He trusted the wrong man," Dante said, his voice quiet, rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I told him not to. I told him the man was a snake." He looked up then, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. He seemed surprised to see her, as if he'd forgotten she was in the house. For a moment, the mask was gone. The cold, calculating boss was replaced by a man haunted by a ghost. "My brother, Marco," he said, his voice flat. All emotion leached from it once more. "He was my partner. He brought a man into our confidence. Vouched for him. The man betrayed him. Betrayed us all. Led our rivals right to him." He placed the photograph back on the mantel with a strange reverence. "Loyalty is the only currency that matters, Amelia. Everything else is just numbers on a page." She said nothing, merely stood there in the quiet of the library. It was not an apology or an explanation. It was a statement of fact. A glimpse into the wound he carried, the failure that drove him. He was a man who had lost the one person he trusted and had decided to never trust anyone again. She saw her own reflection in his story. betrayed by someone she should have been able to trust, left to clean up the mess. The thought was unwelcome, a thread of connection she did not want to feel. She found the atlas and turned to leave. The manifests, he said, his back still to her. The discrepancy is in the weight conversions. The supplier is skimming product at the port in Naples. Find the proof. She paused at the door. He knew what she was working on, without her having said a word. He saw everything. I will, she said. As she walked back to her office, a new resolve settled in her. She was his prisoner, yes, his debtor. But she was not helpless. She had her mind, her skills. Julian had used her as a shield. Dante was using her as a tool. A tool could be sharp. A tool could be useful. And if she was going to survive in this world, she had to be more useful to Dante Moretti than her debt was worth. That night, she made a choice. She would not just work. She would excel. She would make herself indispensable. It was the only path to a different kind of freedom she could see. Therefore, she dug into the manifests with a renewed ferocity, not just as an employee, but as a strategist. Weeks turned into a month. Amelia found the proof Dante needed, tracing the skimmed product to a rival family, the Falcones. Her work was clean, precise, and undeniable. Dante had dealt with the matter in his own quiet, final way. A shipment went missing. A port manager in Naples retired abruptly. The Falcones sent a message of condolence for an unrelated business loss. A silent war was being fought in the margins of her spreadsheets, and she was providing the ammunition. A strange, unspoken respect began to form between them. He would leave complex financial puzzles on her desk without instruction, and she would solve them. She started to anticipate his needs, preparing briefs on potential investments or vulnerabilities before he even asked. She was more than a secretary. She was becoming his analyst, his advisor. The lines were blurring. The danger of her situation, however, was not blurring at all. It was sharpening. One afternoon, Luca escorted her to a town car for a supervised trip to a specialist stationer in the city. It was a small taste of normalcy she hadn't realized she missed. The air of the city, the crowds, the noise. As she was leaving the shop, a sleek black sedan screeched to a halt beside her car. Two men got out, moving with a predatory confidence that made her blood run cold. They were not Dante's men. Luca had his hand on his weapon in an instant, pushing her behind him. Get in the car, Amelia. Now. She fumbled with the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. One of the men smiled, a flash of gold in his mouth. Mr. Falcone sends his regards to Dante's new accountant. He heard she's very thorough. A gunshot cracked through the city noise. Not from Luca. From a rooftop across the street. One of the Falcone men crumpled to the ground. The other scrambled back into his car, tires squealing as he sped away. Luca shoved her into the town car and barked into his phone. Compromised. We're coming in hot. The drive back to the estate was a high-speed blur. She was shaking, the adrenaline a bitter taste in her mouth. They had come for her. Not for Dante. For her. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was a target. When they arrived, Dante was waiting in the courtyard, his face a thunderous mask. He yanked her car door open himself, his grip hard on her arm as he pulled her out. He scanned her from head to toe, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice tight. No, she managed to say, her voice trembling. He didn't seem to hear her. He was looking at Luca. How? They must have been tracking my movements. It was a message. Dante's jaw was a hard line. He turned his furious gaze back to Amelia. For a second, she thought he would blame her, that this was the end. Instead, he did something that shocked her more than the attack. He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. It was the first time he had ever touched her. The contact was electric, a jolt that quieted the frantic beating of her heart. You should have run when you had the chance, he said, his voice low and raw, meant only for her. She met his stormy gaze, her own fear giving way to a strange, defiant certainty. You wouldn't have let me, she replied. It was not an accusation. It was the truth. a confession of the reality that existed between them. They both knew it. He had claimed her, and what Dante Moretti claimed, he protected. But he also never let go. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching, thick with everything unsaid. Then he dropped his hand and turned away, his composure snapping back into place like a steel trap. Double the perimeter guards. No one leaves the estate without my direct authorization. The incident changed everything. She had seen the flash of something personal in his eyes, a possessive fury that went beyond a compromised asset. And she had discovered something in herself. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't panicked. She had analyzed the threat just as she analyzed a balance sheet. In his world, that was survival. But her work on the Falcone problem had made her a liability. Her discovery had made her a target, and Dante's reaction had made it clear that her safety was now tangled up with his pride. The attack lit a fire in her. They had tried to intimidate her, to reduce her to a trembling victim. She would not allow it. She started digging, not into Dante's files, but into the remnants of her old life. She still had access to a cloud server where Julian had stored his personal business dealings, a mess of encrypted files she had never bothered to look at before. She had the password because he was as arrogant as he was careless. She spent her nights, after her work for Dante was done, piecing together Julian's treachery. She crossed a line. She was no longer just his accountant. She was an investigator, moving through the digital shadows of a world she was never supposed to see. She found it buried in a folder labeled Contingencies. A series of emails, encrypted communications between Julian and Lorenzo Falcone. Julian hadn't just embezzled from Dante. He had been feeding information to the Falcones for months, passing on shipping routes, cargo details, everything. He was the snake in Dante's garden. And Marco Moretti's betrayal, the timeline matched. The same man Marco had vouched for had been introduced to him by Julian Vance. It wasn't two separate betrayals. It was one. Julian had helped orchestrate the murder of Dante's brother. The knowledge was a physical weight. This was not about money anymore. This was about blood. She printed the emails, her hands shaking slightly. She knew that giving this to Dante was a point of no return. It would unleash a war. And it would cement her place in his world, not as a debtor, but as a weapon. She walked into his study, without knocking. He was standing by the fire, just as he had been that night in the library, the ghost of his brother always near. He turned, an annoyed look on his face at the intrusion. "What is it?" She laid the printed emails on his desk. "This is why the Falcones came after me. It's not about the manifests. It's about what Julian knew, and what I might find." He picked up the pages, his eyes scanning the first one. The stillness returned to him, but this was different. It was the absolute calm before a hurricane. He read every page in silence, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. When he finished, he placed the papers back on the desk, perfectly aligned. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the full, lethal force of the man she worked for. The cold control was gone, replaced by an abyss of pure, controlled rage. "He used my brother's trust to put a knife in his back," Dante said, each word a chip of ice. "And he used you to cover his tracks." He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He lifted a hand, not to her face this time, but to the side of her neck, his thumb resting on her pulse. It was a gesture of ownership, a claim. "You are not a debt, Amelia," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You are an asset. And you have just handed me the justification for a war I have wanted to fight for 5 years. Her heart was hammering under his thumb. This was it, the line she could not uncross. But she felt no fear, only a cold, clear sense of purpose. Julian had tried to destroy her. Now, she was giving Dante the means to destroy him. It was a dark and terrible form of justice, but it was the only kind that existed in this world. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "They will come for you again. They know you're the only one who could have found this. But this time, we will be ready." The estate transformed into a war camp. Men with hard faces and darker eyes patrolled the grounds. The quiet hum of the house was replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Amelia became the center of the storm. Dante kept her by his side constantly, moving her office into a study. They worked together, ate together, and spent long nights planning, their heads bent over maps and blueprints. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, the scent of his skin, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She used her knowledge of Julian's psychology, his arrogance, his love for theatrics. She knew he would be monitoring the fallout, gloating from his island hideaway. She proposed a plan. They would leak a piece of false information, a rumor that she had found a hidden ledger of Julian's, one that implicated the Falcons not just with Dante, but with the commission itself. It was the kind of lie that would force Lorenzo Falcone to act rashly, to try and silence her permanently before the lie could become truth in the eyes of the other families. "He will send his best men," Dante said, studying her, assessing her. "It will be a bloodbath." "I know," she said. And she did. She had accepted it. This was the cost of her new life. The trap was set at a remote warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront, one of Dante's properties. Amelia was the bait. She would be there, under the pretense of retrieving the non-existent ledger from a safe. Dante and his men would be waiting. The night of the confrontation was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of the river and decay. She stood in the center of the vast, empty warehouse, the single light above her casting long, distorted shadows. She had never felt more alone or more alive. She was not the silent, scared woman who had signed those divorce papers. That woman was gone. The Falcone men came as expected, silent and swift. They surrounded her, their weapons drawn. Lorenzo Falcone himself stepped out of the shadows, a cruel smile on his face. "Such a clever little accountant," he sneered. "Did you really think we would let you walk away with my secrets?" Amelia met his gaze, her own expression calm. "They're not your secrets, Lorenzo. They're Julian's. And he sold them to me for the price of my freedom." It was the signal. Before Falcone could react, the warehouse doors slammed shut. The space was plunged into darkness, then flooded with the blinding beams of tactical lights. Gunfire erupted, a deafening cacophony of violence. Amelia dropped to the floor as she'd been instructed, covering her head. The fight was brutal, precise, and short. Dante's men moved with surgical lethality. When the silence returned, it was heavy and final. Dante appeared at her side, pulling her to her feet. He was untouched, his suit immaculate, but there was a dark splash of blood on his hand. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "It's done," he said. The cost had been paid, in blood and bullets, on the cold concrete floor. Julian's betrayal had finally been answered. They drove back to the estate in silence. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. The war was over. She had survived. She had helped him win. She went to her room, but she couldn't rest. She stood by the window, watching the day break over the forest. She was no longer a prisoner here. She knew the doors were not locked anymore. She could walk out. She could disappear. But where would she go? The ordinary world she came from no longer felt real. She heard her door open. It was Dante. He stood in the doorway, watching her. He had changed out of his suit into a simple black shirt and trousers. He looked younger, the weight of a 5-year vendetta lifted from his shoulders. He walked over to her, stopping just before her. He held out his hand. On his palm lay the heavy gold signet ring. Marco's ring. "He left this for me," Dante said, his voice quiet. "He said to give it to the one person I would trust with my life. The one person who understood that loyalty is everything." He didn't say he loved her. He didn't say he wanted her to stay. He didn't need to. The ring was a contract, an oath. It was his entire world, offered to her in the palm of his hand. It was a crown and a chain all at once. Amelia looked from the ring to his face. She saw the man, not the monster. A man forged by betrayal, who had finally found someone who would not break. She had accepted a divorce in silence, thinking it was an end. She had been wrong. It was a beginning. She reached out and her fingers brushed against his, her touch light on the cold, heavy gold. The choice was hers. And in the quiet of the dawn, she made it.